All right, so jumping into a new package here, and we'll just get started. Um, like I was saying before, the first thing I want to do is like really look at this reference and just identify what we're trying to do here. It is easier to think about this in layers. I don't really want to have to think of it, and I shouldn't think about all these things as like, I don't want to be thinking about the skull and the cobblestones and the mortar and the little pebbles and all the little sand and details all at one time, because I can't do that, right? I'm very dumb. And I think we're all kind of dumb in this way. Like we can't keep the whole picture in our head all at once. So instead, we're going to break it down to just like important stuff first and think about it in terms of layers. And I'm just going to focus on the grout first, right? This kind of mortar layer, because even though it's not the most prominent part of the thing we're trying to do for the most part, like it's mostly going to be cobbles and skulls and fun stuff like that, it is really the bottom-most layer pretty much. And that's something that's always like easier to think about for me, is just to begin with kind of the big thing that's on the bottom, even if it's not, something that's going to make up the majority of the piece. I still think it makes sense to think about it in that way. So what I'm going to do here, you could start with just a polygon because I want to make these kind of shelf layers. I could just start with this. Now, the problem is this is fairly even, right? It doesn't matter how many sides of these I have, or how many sides there are to the polygon rather. It's going to have this situation where all the sides are of equal length. So I'm going to do this trick I like to do when I want to create basically like a polygonal shape, like basically a simplified shape of some sort, but with not fully equal sides. So what I'm going to do here instead is use a splatter circular. So this is like a tile, but we want to use a grayscale one. This is basically a form of tile generation, but it just tiles everything in a circle and by default points them all inward. We can actually use this to our advantage to create that kind of uneven polygon. So what we'll do here is go to our pattern and we'll pick square. And I'm going to put the radius on this really far out so that they basically cross the tile boundary, right? They're beginning to actually go on to they're starting to loop around. If I push this radius even further, right, they'll start to tile and loop around. We can actually turn the tiling on this node off because we don't really care about that. So we can go up to tile absolute and just turn off the tiling. We're not going to care about that here. In fact, it'll just make this easier. So what I'm going to do now is just increase. We probably don't need as many of these. We'll just play with this as we go. But I'm going to increase the size of these, specifically in X. And there we have our, I guess it's I don't know the prefix for 7, I guess. But we're at I think it's hepta. We're at a heptagon. Somewhere between an octagon and a hexagon. Here, we'll make our life easy for us. Here's a octagon. So of equal size. However, if we increase the other size, right, the Y size, we shrink that in, right, because we're making the squares wider. But if we apply some randomness, we get these unevenness to it, right? Because the squares no longer have a consistent depth, I guess, because they have a fairly consistent width right now, but the height or the depth isn't consistent. If we add some randomness to this, we get this unevenness here, which is really cool. And you would want to test this just to be sure that you're not crossing any tile boundaries ever. But this feels pretty cool to me, right? We're able to get this octagon of kind of random side lengths. We'll still have to do some stuff to fix this, but we still have some work to do here, but that's okay. I'm going to also just increase the general size of them to just shrink that shape more. And so instead of just doing the random sizes here, or the set sizes, I just put the scale generally of them up. And now as we play through the randomness slider here, we can see we get these really cool variety of shapes. They're all 8-sided. We can make changes to that later. And I may even increase the size random Y a bit more just to further push that. And I'm going up again to that random seed. And I'm just making sure that we don't have that shape typically crossing one of the tile boundaries. So this is cool. We do want to get that white shape in the middle, kind of like we have with the ordinary polygon. You could invert this. The problem is we're going to have these white shapes around the corner. Now you could get rid of this with like, you could blend a shape on top of it and try to get rid of these kind of white corners we're seeing. There's stuff you could do. I think it's probably easier actually to do a flood fill, even this early. Actually, another thing I'm going to do before we go much further is I'm going to take this whole graph. We don't need 2K here because we're going to be spreading these all over like probably a 4K or a 2K texture. This isn't necessary to have them this big. So to save some like computation speed, I'm just going to set the speed of the parent to absolute, and we'll work at like 512 here or something. This is more than enough. Better to do that sooner rather than later. So we have our flood fill here. What we could do is just go flood fill to random grayscale, or flood fill to grayscale rather, excuse me. And this is just going to sample whatever pixel is in the middle of this cell and flood it that color. Same with all the other cells, right? But if there's nothing up there, they'll just become black. So even if we just put like a square here that's, you know, kind of reasonably sized or something, this will just fill white. And because this white square never touches any of these cells, it's never going to fill them white. They'll just remain black. So this works really well. I like the way this looks. So that's pretty cool. And we'll just do this again. We're going to go back up to the splatter circular and just test this, and you'll see we have this really cool shape. Now we could do some other stuff here if we didn't want to have them always have 8 sides, but we'll come back to that in a sec. For now, we're going to make that layer. So I'm going to bevel this, fill it in all the way, give it full range of value with an auto level. I just want to make sure I have the entire range. And then we're going to histogram scan this to kind of flatten the top. And this is basically our shelf layer, right? This is the equivalent of creating one of these shapes, this almost like shelf or shard, like layer of the mortar. So we do this. We can plug that in if we want, just so we can preview what we're looking at. So I'll make the norm map like considerably stronger, just so we can see it really well. You can like visualize that layer a bit. You can probably push that down a bit more. The individual values I'm punching in don't matter so much. If you're following along and trying to type in the exact numbers, I wouldn't worry about it too much, just as long as you're in the right kind of ballpark and feel. And I encourage experimenting as well, right? So don't worry about punching in the exact same numbers necessarily. To make these easier to layer in the other graphs, something we're going to want to do is have a slope on them. So easiest thing to do, just get a blend, get a gradient linear, and we'll multiply that right over, or even minute, get that nice slice effect. And this works really well. But you can already kind of see where we're going to have that shelf equivalent to our reference. We have that little bevel that goes down, but then we have this like flat area, and they'll be able to overlap each other. So that works fairly well. We could also make this a bit more interesting, because right now the edges are fairly boring, right? They're really, really straight. We probably don't want them to be so perfectly angular. There's a couple things you could do here. We can soften them generally by just blurring this shape, and then histogram scanning it. Blur you can often think about as a smooth, right? And we'll just put on like a low position. So this sort of rounds the corners off a bit. This makes them not so sharp, which I think is a nice addition here. We'll get rid of this smoothing later. That's not the biggest deal. But the other thing we want to do is break up the shape generally, because right now it's quite boring, right? It doesn't, it really is just these 8 possible shapes. So what we're going to do is just, before we do our histogram scan, this is a very normal thing to kind of just reorder this as you're working. But before we do this original scan, right here, let's just use a directional warp. This could be a vector warp too. It could be kind of whatever you want, but I just want to mess up that, make these not so straight. Like right now we have these like perfectly straight lines, and we want to make that a bit more interesting. So I'm going to grab something like a crystal. I like this node a lot for doing this kind of thing. Zooming it into whatever you feel good with, and then I'm just going to directionally warp these. You know, we might need to go higher or something like that. You can plug this in. And that does this really nice job of breaking up the edges and giving us these cool extra plane changes on the way, which is really nice. You can see the difference if we turn it off and turn it on. This makes a much more interesting shape. It feels like a nice kind of carved stone there. The other thing I probably want to do, and we may have to come back and change this potentially, is I don't necessarily like that we have a base here. I kind of want it to start from black. Like I don't want there to be even a little bit of a bevel there. So I'm going to add a level in front of our gradient linear and just push the middle up. So we actually kind of start from pure black there. Give us a much more significant slope. And what's cool about this, once we're all set up here, is we can use the histogram scan position here to change the width of the bevel. If we ever want to come back and adjust that. We'll probably expose this later. So in the other graph, when we're assembling stuff, we can come back and adjust that if we feel like we need to. But I think that's a pretty good start. That's basically all I would really want. It would also be nice to have this so that it's not always 8-sided. There's a couple ways you could do this. I think the easiest way to do it, you could just like expose this parameter, put some random values on it. You could do this a number of ways. Something else you could do is just, I'm probably only gonna ever want like 8, 7, or 6 or something like that. Probably even 8, 7, and 9. Like I don't want that many shapes typically, or sides rather. And what I could do now is actually, this is a trick I like a lot. If you don't want to get into like exposing stuff and tiling all that together, I'm just going to get a tile generator, but make it 1 by 1. And what I'll do now is go to pattern image input rather. And I'll say, give me 3 patterns, plug the 3 in. And then you'll see for what pattern input it should use. Right now it's just random. So as you randomize this tile generator, it's just going to pick one of the 3 random inputs. And what's cool about this is because this has a seed value on it, right? Our tile generator, just like any other node. If I double click anywhere on the graph and seed the entire graph, it also changes. So in this way, you can see we get these really different shards really quickly, which is awesome. And this is basically it for this. I think probably the other thing we might want to do is have a bit of smoothing on that bevel. Because right now we do get all these artifacts here. So over here, this is where they mostly show up. You can check this really easily by putting a normal map on something and putting it to a really high intensity. You can see where we're starting to get these kind of jaggies here. And it's just because this isn't a perfectly straight shape. So there's going to be some aliasing on it, which gets kind of sorted into the normal map here. We can do a bit of smoothing here. We just put like a blur after the bevel here. We can preview it again on that normal. It's just sometimes easier to see the artifacts on the normal map. And obviously this is too much. So we can put it up just a little bit. And because I want it to end all of a sudden, you can see like when we had the previous shape before we blurred it, it ends basically on a dime, right? There's some aliasing obviously, but it ends really subtly, quickly. If we blur it, it kind of fades out a bit more. But we can fix that or adjust it at least by plugging that blur into a level and pulling the black, like the level in low, in a little. And now it ends actually sharper than it was originally. Then this will just help. Just rearrange these a bit. And put that blur before the auto levels because we just want to make sure we always have our full value range. That just clears up those edges. We probably want to level it again at the end, in fact. Like if we go here, see how we have these kind of get a little too blurry for my liking? And that's just because of this directional warp. You can see where they happen here, right? It's totally fine before this. But then after the warp, you get these kind of the softness here. So we can do the same thing. Just get a level, and I'll plug it in here just so you can see it. And I'll pull that in just to tighten up the transition there. First, what we should do, we don't really need these outputs anymore. If we need to preview something, we can later. But we should make a new output because we're going to put this into a new graph and we just need a single output, which is this height. You can name this. It doesn't have a label by default, but I think something like output would be totally fine. And I would want to name this something like, we'll call this like gen for like generate or whatever you want. You call it source, you call it whatever you'd like. I'm going to call this mortar slice generator. And then we'll start a new graph and go from there. So I'm going to make a new graph and call this something like mortar generator. You can call it mortar layer, whatever you'd like. The naming convention isn't important as long as it's coherent to you and you're able to understand what you're doing. But here's where we're going to assemble the actual mortar portion of the material, or at least its height map. We might build an albedo in here as we go just to sort of preview what we're doing so we have an idea of what it will look like at the end. But really all this graph is going to do is put out a height map that we're going to use in the ultimate graph to combine everything together. So you can pull that generator in here. This graph we will actually keep at 2K. It's possible we need this at 4K at the end. We'll just have to see how we get along with. But these mortar graphs are like the mortar slice generator here, rather, is totally fine to stay at this kind of 512 resolution. So we're just going to tile this around to create those layers. So we'll just create a tile sampler because we may need some extra controls potentially. You can leave this as the generator if you'd like. But I use the sampler just because it's potential. It is a bit more costly. It's more expensive, but it's possible we want to use some of these input maps later. And I like to have that option kind of from the beginning. Oftentimes you'll use a tile generator. You'll be building stuff and then realize, oh, I wish I could use like the scale map. And you have to kind of go through the process of converting this into a tile sampler. And I would rather just stay with this. And if I don't need it, I'll just go the other direction. So we'll start by plugging this guy in, and we'll start with a lot of them because we want to create, it's hard to see because they're covered in rocks, right? But there's probably these really big layers before we get down to these smallish layers. Some of these smallish layers will happen kind of by accident as we subtract different things in the height map. But we really want to get these, like, you always want to work from like big to small shapes. You'll hear me say that, like, you know, stop me when you've heard it like for the millionth time. I'll say it a lot. So I'm going to start with like 6 by 6. We might even need less, but we'll just start there. I'm going to switch the tile sampler to pattern input so we get our shapes here. Then I'm really just going to give this some generic interest here. So I kind of want them heading in a similar direction so that they're able to layer really well. So I'm going to rotate these. I'm not looking for like a particular angle or anything. I'm just doing what feels right. Sure. For some reason, I always tend to want to stack things towards the bottom left corner. I'm not sure why that is, but I think I just might be because I'm left-handed. I'm not sure why it is. But we can scale these up. And you'll see that because the tile sampler, which unlike its tile generator cousin, its blend mode is set to max by default, which means that the brighter of these two colors is going to always come over the other one. A tile generator is set to add set to add by default, which is going to make your texture really bright. But if it's on max, the brighter of the two versions of this tile is always going to come on top of the other one, right? So we've done a lot of stuff on blend modes before, but just so people can see it, if I make these guys smaller and we add them on top of each other, which is what the tile generator would do by default, we're really just adding those values onto each other. So you get this kind of like ghosting, right? Where all the values from this tile have been added to the values from this tile. And we get this kind of, we can see through it almost because we're adding those numbers together. However, if you use max, just the brighter of the two values between the different tiles shows up, which gives us this really cool stacking effect. And that's the behavior we want to have happen in the tile sampler as well. So max it is. And then we can just add some random scale. Right, because we don't need them all to be the same size. And we definitely want to scramble their positions. So I'll pull the position. I'm not putting it on a specific number. I'm just scrambling until I like the look of it, really. And if you want, you could add some like size random in some different directions, just a little bit. And then I might add a little bit of rotation random. I don't really want them to be scattered in like every possible angle because we get these sort of intersections that I don't think are super nice looking, really. I'm not crazy about that, so I'd rather just keep them slightly off, right? Like they're not perfect, but they're sort of askance here. And you can see we're already getting some kind of cool layering effects here just from having the max blending mode with the different layers where they sort of like cross over each other and create interesting stuff. I'm going to go ahead and build a levels. This level isn't doing anything, but we're just using it to hold stuff. You could, if you want, just use a dot node, right? So I'm just holding the Alt key down and while hovering over a noodle and pressing left click to create the node. We'll do stuff with those later. I'm in the habit of just using a levels node for no reason. This is just the way. Well, you know what? I do know the reason. We didn't always have these dot nodes. And especially we didn't have the portal functionality of it, right? So I'm just used to doing it this way. I don't use this level for much, but it is just like a holder, really. And I'll put this out into normal. And again, this is really just so we can see as we're working. I'm not really, I might even plug in a little bit of AO or something. This is just so we can, and these are very wet stones right now, which honestly makes it nice. Usually having it, the roughness be a little darker than you need is helpful. Just it helps you see the specular roll and it makes it a bit more legible. But I wanted a bit rougher than that, just so sometimes having the thing feel like the material it's going to be, it gives it a certain jouissance. I'm not really sure how to explain it. I guess it's because your brain is thinking you're looking at stone. And so having it, even like from a light perspective, react similarly can help you feel a bit more connected to it, I guess, for lack of a better word, or just maybe notice things you wouldn't notice otherwise. So I wanted a bit rougher. But you can see this is already really cool. And like I said, we're already getting some interesting like kind of layering going on, which is not too dissimilar from what we have here, where these stones do kind of just cross on top of each other. They have this kind of layering effect where they lay themselves over one by one, which is cool. So I like the look of this. We do have a bunch of missing stuff here. Like we probably want to scale these up a bunch, but before we do that, let's add some more versions of this. Because right now we're just tiling the exact same section over and over and over. So I'm going to duplicate this and just hit the random seed button here. Get a different version. Ooh, I like that. There's no real science to this, right? Like I'm just hitting the button until I find something I like the look of, really. We can go down to pattern input on the tile sampler and change the total number of inputs. And you see we get new pattern inputs here. So let's actually load it up to like 5, maybe even 6. 6 is the default, though you can do more if you want to create like a custom one. I think I actually have mine. Or I guess I don't have I have my tile generator extended where I've added additional ones. So on this node, I've made it so that I can add way more. This is something we can do in a future video, but this guy can do up to 24 inputs. There's no real reason why it's limited to 6. You can go and change that if you'd like. So we'll put this in here. And now we have, some of them are going to use sample 1. Some of them are going to use sample 2. And we'll just do this a couple times, right? Just looking for an interesting shape, trying to get some variety. If these are kind of cool. You can see them just kind of layer in as we add them, which is nice. And again, there's no real rhyme or reason here. We're not looking for anything in specific. Or I guess I am looking for something specific, just something that looks cool. Like that's an interesting shape that's like not really like anything we have so far. Right? That adds a bunch. You do have to be careful sometimes about adding stuff that's too unique at this point because it makes it much more obvious that it repeats. You can see this very clearly. This shape is kind of obvious when you see it again, whereas the other ones aren't as obvious. But we're going to do a ton of other texture to this. So even if you see that if you see some repetition in the shape or you see a shape kind of showing up over and over, I wouldn't worry about it a ton because we're going to like do a ton of stuff to them. We'll just do this one last time. Just for another kind of interesting shape. Yeah, I think that's cool. And then again, yeah, the size is a little small here, so we might just scale this, or like we have all this gap, right? It's relatively easy to get rid of that. I'm gonna actually scale these so that they are wider than they are tall. Right, so I'm just making, or longer, I guess you could think about, like this. I might even scale the whole thing up, just to try to close those gaps up. Cool. I think this works really well. And again, this is just that first layer, right? We're going to do a bunch more to this. Some other stuff you could do if you wanted to is control some of these things with an input texture. Like, so I could grab something like a cloud. I generally don't like how white the cloud is by default, so I tend to auto level it. And we have a video on the channel about histograms, so you can kind of touch up there. But I just want to have a more like equal histogram. There's actually histogram equalize as well, which is just going to try to spread the values out so that they have equal representation. So something like this can work really well. It's really up to you how you want to do it, but I just like having some more variety there where the cloud tends to be very bright. I'm going to plug this into the scale map input on the tile sampler. And what this does is it allows you to scale. Right now we just have scale random on. We can turn the scale multiplier on, and what that's going to do is scale these based on that input texture. So if that, the one slice or whatever showed up somewhere where it was dark, it's going to be really small. You just can't see it because it's underneath. And anywhere it's white, they're going to be really big. So an easy way to see this would be if you take something like a gradient linear and plug it in. You'll see that all the small ones are at the bottom and all the big ones are at the top. The reason why you're seeing some big ones at the bottom is just because these big ones that are on top are wrapping around. But this can be nice, I kind of like the feel of it more than random often. And obviously the effect is really strong, so we can go back to the tile sampler and turn that scale map multiplier down. And I usually do actually put a little bit of scale random on it as well. But this is just a personal preference thing. Like if you want to do something specific, you definitely need those input maps. Like you can control scale, color, like input pattern distribution, whatever you'd like with that. But for me, I'm not so worried about it right now. Cool. So there's this sort of first layer. If you wanted to, there's no reason why you couldn't put this into a separate graph, just like we have with the mortar tile generator, so that we could seed it as well. Right? So we could take this and just get other versions of it. Right? You could also just play with this right now to see if there's like a version you prefer. This is kind of cool when you get this little like gap there. It's kind of interesting. You can see like, I always like how this looks. Like even this, I mean, I'll long contend it's constantly a pain for me that oftentimes AO is like the coolest stuff is going to look. Texturing, it's only going to get worse from here, basically. But this is cool. What I want to do now is create a second version of this tile sampler that has higher frequency. So what I mean is I'm going to copy these, right? I just Control C, Control V. These are going to be the same sampler essentially, or same inputs, I suppose. But on this one, we're going to get a different seed. And I want to have more of them. And not a ton more, maybe like 50% more, something like that. But the idea is this one is a lot more frequent. There's a lot more of them. And maybe I want to just play with the scale map. Just to get... The other thing I can do is take some of them out. If I think that there's too many of them, for instance, you can go down to the mask random and call some of them out. But what I'm going to do with this is use this and interact with the other layer here. So something like this. You can see we do whatever we want. Like I could max these on, and now we're going to have these smaller shapes as well. Right? Because these ones are just whatever is the brighter of the two layers, because we're using a max blending mode, is going to come through. You could eat away at them too. I could do something like a subtract. And now that's going to be really intense. We can pull it back. You're trying to create these like steps down now. Right? So it's just kind of, it's creating like additional layering essentially. I'm not sure if I like the subtract as much. What you could do is min these, right? So the reverse of max. So I'm going to try like inverting the grayscale and then setting this to min. And this can look really cool too. So min is the same thing as max, except it's letting the darker of the two values through. And actually like this, because we get these really cool slices. Like here's a great example, right? That's harder to do with the other blend modes, but this just takes what was originally one layer here and breaks it up into several smaller sections. If you've done any sculpting or something in ZBrush or whatever, really, this should be like pretty familiar. right? You start with these big shapes and then you kind of slowly make them more complicated. But I don't mind this. There's probably more adjustments to be made. We could always go back and, I'm sure we'll do, oftentimes when you're working in Designer like this, a ton of what, I'm going to make them a bit wider, for example. I just want to make these layers wider. A ton of what you're doing in Designer is just kind of getting your ideas out of your head onto the canvas and working. And then you're just going to do, lots and lots and lots of iterations. Like, I'm not crazy about how deep these are. I almost prefer these to be shorter. So we'll take the size wide down, but wider. That's a different look for sure. That I don't hate actually, but I think we could probably find a more happy medium here. So I like the look of that. I think that's very fun. Looking at our reference, right? Again, we're just trying to look for that area where we have that consistent overlap, where you have this layer clearly in front of this one, clearly in front of this one. You have that sort of hierarchical approach to it. I will use this for color later, as mentioned. But this is not in a bad spot, I don't think. And like I was saying, a ton of what you're going to do here is like constant revisions going back. Like right now, I'm not crazy about the fact that they all look very similarly sized, these layers. So I might go over here and really try to push that size random a bit more, so that we get some like variety in the steps. Right now we have these kind of small layers, but we still have some pretty big ones. Right, you want to kind of have some areas of rest, some areas of, a lot more busyness, right? So an area over here is a lot more relatively higher frequency detail, and it can draw your eye, and the eye can kind of rest in these bigger areas that are relatively plain. So this looks not bad. I'm okay with this as the base layer. What we're going to do now is just try to warp these a bit. Like, they're still awfully clean, right? Like, they look sort of like chiseled out of fresh. They have this kind of clean look to it, which is really nice. And if you're making something maybe a bit more, with a certain style to it, maybe you do stop here where you want those kind of clean, plain changes, those fancy edges there. But these are pretty chewed up in the reference. If we're going for something, a bit more, it's certainly more higher frequency, a bit more worn and beaten up. So we want to adjust those more. What we could do here, this is like a favorite thing I like to do. Usually slope blur is what you head to when you're thinking about stuff like this. So you could take a slope blur like that. And we just need an interesting input map here to warp this by. There's a tons of things you can do here. Like even a crystal, set the samples generally pretty high, although there are reasons to make it lower, but not today. And you can see this does beat all the edges. Well, it beats everything up, not just the edges. To redirect all these, just as an aside, I'm holding shift before I click on the node and then letting go here. So this is obviously a little intense. Slope blur intensity, especially if you're trying to do it to the whole texture, is usually quite weak. So you can see this does cause some breakup along the edge. I'm not crazy about this input texture, but there's all sorts of other noises obviously you can experiment with to try to create more breakup here. A favorite for me that I really like, especially when I'm taking like rocks and I want to like shear them apart, I really like the Crystal 2. I think I find this one really nice. It does a really good job, I think, of like creating these separations, which I think are really cool. And that's just because you have these like relatively large jumps in value, right? So that's where you're going to get the strongest effect in the slope blur, where you're going to blur the texture along that slope that changes value so quickly. The thing you might not like about this potentially is the fact that it's you can see that it's got this like real directionality to it, right? Like it really, it's very up and down, which is maybe okay, but maybe we would rather it flow kind of in the direction of the tiles, which is kind of in this direction. So if you're trying to rotate something on a 45-degree angle, the safe transform grayscale is really great because it'll allow you to actually do a 45-degree rotation and still not have the tiling break. Right? I'm pressing the space button to preview the tiling. That little red border is the actual 0 to 1 texture we're looking at. If I hit space, we can see everything outside of it. But this will at least keep the direction consistent. Right now we have these lines that are going kind of against, like they're perpendicular to the planes of all of the big shapes. So I think something like that is pretty good. You also will want to play around with the blend mode on the slope blur. Blur right now, you can watch my video on slope blurs. I think that'll probably be a good kind of companion to a lot of slope blurs we're going to do in here. I'll probably make a list here to kind of reference all the important stuff. Min is really cool because it only eats away at the shape along the slope. So it does preserve some of these more chunky edges while still allowing it to be eaten away at. It's almost like an erosion. And on things like stones, I think that's like really helpful. We get these nice breakups here. And it's again, sort of like it happened when we jumped from the one tile sampler layer to the second tile sampler layer. Right, we had these big planes, and then we added this second tile sampler here, and we broke those into smaller, more frequent planes, right? We're basically doing the exact same thing again here, taking those smaller planes and breaking them up again into these even smaller planes, creating more high frequency. And if you don't like how quickly these change potentially, or how severe the transitions can be along this edge, you can blur the safe transform. Right? Obviously, if you blur it a lot, the transitions are really smooth. It's going to get really goopy. And the less you blur it, the tighter that kind of shearing becomes. So it's a balancing act, and it really just depends on what you're trying to do. Like, if we don't like how severe those are, we can add a little bit of a blur just to soften that transition. But if you prefer it to have that really kind of, chunky, really sharp look, then you would just play with this blur intensity. But this looks pretty good. The other thing we might want to do is, I know the direction is generally flowing with or perpendicular to the planes, right? All of our planes flow this way, or this way rather, and then the warp is going this way, or the slope blur rather. What we could do now as well is what if we did actually want a little bit of warping going the perpendicular direction? So what I would do is just reuse this crystal just to save some speed. So I'm just going to transform this and move it slightly, just so it's in a different position. And then do another safe transform grayscale. So I just copied it, right? Control C, Control V. And this one I'll rotate opposite. And I'll overlay this on top of it. Right? Got to switch the inputs there. To switch the order of the inputs, you can select them both and just press X. But now what we're doing is we're basically doing the same thing here, but instead I can actually blend in a little bit of going the other direction. Right, I could have them both fully mixed. Right now we kind of just this like madness crisscrossing everywhere, which could be fine potentially. There's probably nothing wrong with this either, but we can also feather that down and have it predominantly in the one direction, but mix in just a little bit of the opposite direction. But I think that feels pretty good. Another type of warping you can do just to break this up even more is use something like a vector morph. So this is a bit of a more complicated node. We'll do an entire video on this at some point, but essentially this is like if you ever used a flow map, it's very similar. You're going to use an input texture kind of, vector to it. So some gray values in the red channel and the green channel of a texture in order to move the pixels in certain directions, right? A higher value will move it more in that direction. A lower value will move it less in that, or it'll move it in the reverse direction. Positive X, negative X, positive Y, negative Y. For now, it's okay to just think about that you will normally be plugging a normal map. Or not normally, but often you'll be plugging a normal map into this vector field. So I could make a normal map of this warping texture that we just made, and I'll make it pretty strong. I'd rather the normal map be too strong and then make the intensity on the morph less intense. But this does a really good job of really shearing those layers apart. Again, it's really intense, so I'll probably want to tone it down. But it's just another great way of trying to get that erosion and beating up the edges here where we have those slopes. Maybe make it a little less intense. But it does a really fantastic job of, and it introduces all these interesting little bits of noise and detail, which I think go a really long way. That works really well. Some other stuff we can do is we probably want to put in even an additional layer of noise, even more really. Or I mean, there's enough. We can take this kind of any way we want, really. Another cool trick is to actually continue putting on additional layers in the same way we've been doing with the extra tile sampler layer here, and then again by using our morphs and our slope blur. I'm going to auto level our height map here just because we're losing this happens often. Like you're doing so much math to this, you're sort of mangling it because eventually everything starts to go middle gray because you're adding and minning and maxing and subtracting. Eventually things kind of lose that range. So I'm going to put an auto level back here just to make sure we have black somewhere on the height map, white somewhere on the height map. But what I like to do, often this is just like a quick thing, it really helps speed you up, is to just use this texture again and overlay it on top of itself. So you can get something like just a safe transform or just a normal transform even, and scale out of this and maybe just offset a bit so it's not exactly in the right place. And then you can do something like just subtract this from the original texture. The nice thing about this is you're reusing something you've already built. So we can subtract this. We'll make that like a lot weaker. Right, so this just puts even more layering on. Obviously, if you put it really intense, you're going to get a ton of extra noise here. We don't need it to be that strong, just a little bit. And the cool thing about this is, like I was saying, it reuses all of the stuff we've already done. We get to just reuse here. And another cool thing about it is a lot of the shapes it's going to create here, like when we subtract stuff there, for instance, or up here, I suppose, they're going to echo the shapes that are already present. Right, so it's not like we're introducing like a whole new shape that's going to maybe potentially at least be out of place. This can actually kind of merge into it fairly well, like fairly seamlessly, and look quite good. I kind of prefer that look. We can make this different too. Like right now we're kind of plastering it everywhere, and maybe that's fine, but we can do some more fancy stuff if we'd like. So what we could do is actually try applying this unevenly on top of its original layer, so that it's stronger in some areas than others. We could start thinking about that maybe even with a flood fill. So I'm going to make a flood fill of this, of the layer that happened before it. And we'll go up top here, and we're probably going to do a bit of extra work to the side here. And this is a bit of an experiment, which is fine. You're going to do lots of these. But what I'm going to do is run that into a curvature, because I'm going to use the curvature to identify all the separate sections here. Right, and the concavity, all these like black areas here. So I'm going to histogram scan it like this. I always start at 0.51, like halfway through just slightly over halfway through the texture, and full contrast. It's a little intense, so I might have to bring it up a bit more. But the hope here is to try to get at least some full cells. We put this into a flood fill. Right now we have very few full cells, so we're probably going to need to scan this back a bit more. And we may even have to do something like, a lot of these aren't fully closing up. So you could do something like blur this, right, so that the colors bleed into each other a bit, and then histogram scan it again. And that you'll see like closes up a ton of these shapes. The idea is I'm just trying to create all these different cells. And this doesn't have to be super tidy. In fact, it can look fairly messy. But it's just an interesting way of creating that mask to modulate the intensity of this layer going on top of its bigger kind of cousin. That I think is interesting, and especially when doing rocks, I think can add to that kind of layering look. So I'm going to take that flood fill and do a flood fill to random grayscale, just to get some different sections here. Now, a lot of this is really unusual because of the thickness of these black lines. We can go back to our blur and maybe lower the intensity, because maybe we don't need to be so strong. And the scan needn't be that strong either. Like I said, this isn't a perfect science. We're just trying to create something that looks like this, like some interesting layered sections here. We want to close these black gaps, right? The flood fill always creates these black gaps where obviously this was the mask going into it. Right? So it creates these islands, and then we get the random grayscale per island, but we want to get rid of the black stuff in between the islands. Whenever you're going to do that, you're going to get a distance, or whenever you want to do that, you're going to get a distance node, if I can spell it, get a distance node, plug that into source, and then typically whatever went into the flood fill also goes into the, like, the way you can remember it is the flood fill has a mask input and the distance also has a mask input. They go into the same thing. And then you can see it gets kind of blurred in there because it's trying to stretch, it's calculating the distance to the nearest white pixel. So what you could do on the distance, or you should do in this case, is set it to only source. And if you want to be really safe, just set this to full distance. And now we have these just sections of grayscale. We could actually, maybe if you want to preview it, you could put it into base color. You can just see that like different slices of our height map here are getting kind of color coded these different grayscale values. Like even this looks really neat. And it's something that, you know, you could imagine a situation where you had this on a much lower intensity. It's actually not a bad way to affect the albedo, maybe. Not what we're worried about right now, but it is kind of cool. Where you kind of tint all these sections a little different. So we'll worry about that later. But for now, what we're going to do is use this as a mask. Because we don't like that this noise is just laying over top of our big noise. Right? Here's our big rock layer from earlier. And our small rock layer is just directly over top of it. It's just kind of pasted over top of each other with no kind of special interaction. What we could do is directionally warp the high frequency one, the zoomed out one, with this mask. And this is going to rip the texture apart. Right? Because the way the directional warp works is that higher values or different values, or you can see very easily if you just put, again, often you'll use a gradient to test these things. You put a gradient linear into the directional warp and put the intensity really high, you'll see that the texture is warping to the left, right? The warp angle, but it's warping much more at the top where we have white on the intensity input of directional warp, and much less at the bottom, in fact, none, where we have black. So you can think of this as sort of, let's say you plug in 200 as your intensity input. You can almost think of this as just like a mask like that multiplies against that number. So sure, up here, you're getting 200 times 1 because you have a value of 1 up here. It's just white. So that's moving 200 units or whatever. It's going really far. At the bottom, the 200 is being multiplied by 0, so it's not moving at all. You can see that if instead of having just a gradual transition of gray values, if we just have it end on a dime, it rips the texture into two parts because the bottom isn't moving at all. The top is moving quite a bit, right? Whatever the warp intensity is. So if you think about it with our texture here, we're going to rip it apart anywhere we have this jump in value. So you can see it here as we put a really high number in the directional warp intensity. But we need much higher than this. We're sort of shredding that texture apart, which is pretty sweet. And what I'm going to do then is just subtract this instead. So I think this is just a decent way, again, of introducing more and different types of noise. We got these kind of cool pits now going. And it's possible you want to blur this slightly so it's not so strong. Just a tiny bit. Something like that. Then we create all these extra cool bits of noise. And they don't necessarily carry over from layer to layer. They can all be a little different. Right? You're not going to have the same noise necessarily carry from this to this perfectly. It's going to snap right there and become a different part of the noise. So I think that looks fairly good. Another thing you could do if you just want to add some general breakup here is to take something like a cells 1 maybe. And like I said, a lot of this is just kind of experimentation. But you could take something like this and subtract it from the height map here. You can see when it's really intense, it's quite obvious, right? We're just kind of beating this up even more, creating all these plane changes. This is very intense. And it's probably too zoomed in. We probably want to zoom this guy out a little bit. And it's probably too intense. You can also see that we're starting to bottom the height map out. For instance, like if I subtract here, this value is already so dark, wherever that is on the texture. It's probably like over here or something. Let's actually just find it. It's like right here. This value is so dark that when we subtract it, it's actually hitting black and it's starting to bottom the height map out. We can see it start to get flat. Like that. We probably don't want that. This is cool for other things potentially. If you have like, sand coming in or something, maybe like pools of water perhaps. But to counteract that, we could, before we do the subtract, raise this a little. So I'm going to create a level before we do our subtraction and just take the level out black or low and raise the black value a little bit before we subtract. So that gives us much more room to subtract that noise before we actually end up bottoming the texture out. And maybe we don't like the look, you'll do this a lot, but maybe we don't like the look of the cells going over the entire texture uniformly, right? Like it's present here and here and here and here and here, like it's just everywhere. So you probably want to mask that. You can just take stuff like a cloud or something and plug that into the opacity here. It's just to make it not as strong in certain areas and a bit stronger in others. Just to make that example really clear, right? You could histogram scan this so that that cloud is really white, really black. And you'll see in some areas it's really intense, in some areas it's not intense at all. You could do that. Another thing you can do if you're lazy like me, and you'll see me do this a lot, is just take the previous noise and just move it a bit or rotate it 90 degrees or something. And I think that does a pretty natural job of masking that. Right? Let's just take this and unplug it just so you can see the difference this makes. Particularly somewhere here, right? We can see the lines of that cells pretty well. But if we plug this in, we end up breaking that up quite a bit. And we add these nice little layers again, right? And because we're using for our mask kind of an iteration on a layer that we already used, a bunch of shapes we've been kind of accustomed to using already throughout the material, the result is really coherent, right? Like the noises line up quite well. They don't have this huge difference between them like we had with the clouds, or if we used a crystal or something. Although I think the crystal would be a bit better. We took something like the crystal and leveled it so it's not so black and white. Something like this could work. But you do introduce like a brand new type of noise. And obviously you could make this better, right? If you spent some time on it. But I really like the look of reusing those things. And it's easy, right? It's one of those things that's a win in all directions because it's fairly easy to do. You just make a transform node. It's cheap for the graph. It's fast for the graph to run. It's fast for me to build because I don't have to do a ton of stuff. And I actually think it looks better a lot of the time for very little downside. So I think this is looking nice. We're probably at the point where we need to start thinking about higher frequency detail. We're kind of stretching. We're kind of at the medium level stuff at this point. It would make a lot of sense to get some higher frequencies in there. Another thing we can do is consider taking the noise and maybe adding an additional layer to get even more medium frequencies. So I might take the same thing. We're just going to reuse noises we have. So I'll take this noise, zoom out from it a bit, like that. Generally, I'm against tiling detail within a tile. So you can see this 4 times. So every time you'll see everything else once. Because we're doing it just as like a blend here, I actually don't think it's going to matter a ton. But what I'm going to do is like scan this to get the white high points here. Something like that. And just subtract it from our original height map that came before it. You can see it'll be really strong at first. Right? We're really kind of chewing it up. But if we chill that out a bit, again, you can see we're really just introducing some more medium frequency detail here, additional layers. Right, if you squint, right, and especially since you know how this is built, because we've been working on it together, you can still see our original big shapes. But for people that are new to it, like if you just start watching here, it's actually not as easy to see as you'd think. People mostly see the complication of all the stuff here, and hopefully this is illustrating for you like that these things look complicated at first glance, but if you pare them back and work at them layer by layer, just looking at each, low frequencies, big shapes to high frequency, small shapes, it actually is quite legible. Like I can still see what I did here. Like here's the big shape and where I ate away at it. I think it is getting a little noisy. And again, we might want to mask where this one on. Like we don't want this to go everywhere uniformly either. So we could just take even like a Gaussian noise or something and mask this a bit. And you see all that did is it's just not as intense everywhere. Like here, it just weakened a bit. So some areas it'll be stronger than others. So you can see the difference, right? If I really pull this intensity in and we don't have that mask, it's quite brutal. It's everywhere really strong. But that mask really does help soften it quite a bit, which I like the look of. I think that helps a lot. But I think with something like this, and this is obviously still too strong, so we'll dial that back. I think with something like this, we're basically good to move on to the higher frequencies. One thing I'd like to do that we forgot to do is I forgot to add some random symmetry to these. So just so you can see how this works when it's not, covered in all this junk. If you have, we'll just make it like 3x3 and plug this image input in. Up top at the pattern rollout of the tile generator, you have this rotation random and symmetry random. Rotation random will just apply a random rotation to it that's either like 90, 180, or 270. Like it's going to do some kind of 90-degree rotation to them randomly. We probably don't want to do that because we actually like this kind of flow of it moving from top right to bottom left. But symmetry random is pretty cool. This just flips them. So they'll either be flipped horizontally or vertically, just randomly. But in our case, we wouldn't want them to flip vertically, right? We don't want them to turn around upside down. We only want them to move potentially horizontally. And the nice thing about doing this is we just get more out of these same 5 shapes we have here. So I'm going to go back here and make sure we have some of that symmetry on. So I'm going to go to symmetry random, set it to only horizontal, and just crank it to full. And that just means we'll get more variety out of those shapes. We'll get much more mileage because we're having some that are flipped, some that are not. And I think that goes a long way to kind of increasing the amount of like reusability of those rocks. This is cool. And like I said, we'll probably go through and just do a balance pass here of just, this stuff looks good. I think at some point in here, we get a little too noisy. So you can just like say, hey, what happens if I take that out? Do I care about that? Yeah, I kind of want that one. But maybe it's this that's too noisy when we put the cells over it. And I actually agree. I think this is, actually, this can soften it a little. I don't mind that one in particular. You know what? I've decided I like them all. It could be that this one adds a little too much, but we'll just tone that back a little. Oftentimes what you'll do is like look at that layer getting added on, or subtracted in this case. And I basically go to like can see it and then pull it back until I can barely tell it's there. So it's sort of just this like subtle shift. I think this is cool. We probably want to break up the big shapes here a little bit more, but we'll revisit that. We'll see how stuff works in the main graph. We can always come back. It's such a nice thing about designers. We can always come back and adjust that later if we feel we need to. For now, I think it makes sense to move on to those high frequency details. So we're going to lay in, there's a ton of like really fine noise, right? You can imagine if you kind of cross your eyes or blur, just try to unfocus your eyes, you'll see that there's just this like high frequency spotty noise all over kind of everything here, right? It's just really highly repetitive, busy noise. we are going to want to next do something to replicate that. You can see all of our medium shapes. If you blur your eyes, all you see are the medium shapes, which is what we have already. But next, we're definitely going to want to work on those high frequency details. Okay, so let's add on some of that high frequency detail. There's no real science to this necessarily. We're going to try a couple different things to see what we like, but generally trying to keep with that trend of working from big to small, even when it comes to the higher frequencies. So we'll start with some bigger, small noise, and then slowly get smaller and smaller, small noise. So I'm going to make a nice separation here in the graph. So we'll probably do a step back and organize this at some point just to make sure it's nice and tidy. But for now, I'm just going to grab something like a black and white spot. I like this one. You get a good mix of stuff. Like there's some medium frequencies in here for sure. We can pass some of that out later if we need to. You can go ahead and just like directly add sub this one on just to see, like get an idea for what it looks like. And it's possible that we'll need to zoom this one out. And obviously that's way too intense, so we'll pull it back. But this is a pretty good job of just putting this sort of like uniform pitting. It's also the case that the AO is probably giving you a little bit of a false idea of how deep those pits are actually right now. It's easier to see in the norm map. They're fairly shallow, even with the norm map as weak it is. We probably bump that up. You can always tune this down. Right now it is quite intense, so I think having that be down a bit, or honestly unplugged for now, is better. Just it gives you, sometimes you just got to be careful because a lot of the times that AO, if it's strong enough, can make it seem like these cracks are like much, much more significant than they really are. So this is cool and just adds kind of this uniform noise. I'd like to make these a bit bigger. So I'm going to do this trick where you can just inflate these a bit. So you run it into a slope blur and then you blur the original result. And you just leave it on blur mode on the slope blur. And you're going to put a really low intensity, but you can see that this sort of, it almost reminds me a little bit of like paint daubs in Photoshop. But it's slightly, well, a lot different really. It kind of inflates the shapes here because they're just blurring along the already blurred input texture, and this blur might be a little too strong. You can go back and tune that as much as you want, but this is worth trying. This is going to make a bit of a different result, right? These are a lot, it's much bigger of a noise now, but I kind of like it. Like I said, even with the small noises, we want to work big to small, starting with like the biggest small noises all the way to the smallest ones. And we might want to zoom this out a little bit. I just took the black and white spots and moved it to scale 2 instead of 1. And that looks pretty good. We get a nice mix of stuff, and it just adds these little cracks and details. The slope blur might be a little too strong. It's already really weak, but it doesn't take much when you're working with frequencies this high. Some of the things you can do is, right now it is awfully uniform, so we can mess that up a bit by using something like a non-uniform blur. And like I said, I'm lazy here. I want to reuse stuff I already have, and makes the graph cheaper. Don't have to think as much necessarily. Or just give this a little bit of an offset. I'm not looking for anything magic here. Just want to move the texture a little so it's not like, it's obvious. It's not exactly the same as this. It's a little bit different. And I've inverted it too for that same reason. These two are just here to make this a little different without having to grab a whole new one. And we'll use that as the mask for the non-uniform blur. And this can be really cool, because it'll just smooth out some areas and keep some areas relatively sharp. And that can be a good mix of noise. If we don't want, right now that non-uniform blur is blurring it stronger in areas where this mask is white and weaker where it's black. So we could, if we want, make that a little bit more selective. But now you get this cool result where we don't have even detail everywhere. And I need to go to the non-uniform blur and turn it down a bit. It's a little strong. Now it's probably a little too weak. So try like 0.7. Again, don't get too hung up on the exact numbers I'm doing. I'm going to put the samples up. This is one of those things where the samples will increase the cost of the node for sure. When it's all said and done, especially blades, will make it a lot more expensive. I'm not really noticing a ton of a difference, so I'm happy having it be low samples. Blades is almost like a multiplier for the samples here. So obviously both is really, really high quality. I don't think I really need it just because we have such a high frequency noise here. It's not coming up as much. But I think this is cool because we get like a bit of a varied surface. right? Some areas are a bit more lumpy, a little less defined. Some are quite a bit more defined. And that's not a bad spot to be, I think. We'll do something different now. Again, just trying to work through those noises. I'm going to grab something like, let's steal this guy again. You know what? We use a safe transform grayscale just so that we're able to rotate it on a 45 degree. And you can do some fun stuff here too. I'm going to basically do this again, but we're going to run it through a histogram scan and try to get some real peaks here. And what you'll notice is I'm trying to grab peaks of this noise. It's pretty difficult. I really want to grab the whitest parts, right? Get it really speckly. But with the histogram scan, since there's so many big blurry shapes here, it's hard to not grab all of them. This is where you can use something like a high pass. What this does, it just sort of passes out the higher frequency or the lower frequencies and leaves you with the high frequencies. So you can see that fairly obviously in something like a cloud. So there's a lot of frequencies here, right? There's a lot of smaller shapes that are very frequent. They occur all the time. And then there's a bunch of large shapes. You can see if you kind of traced out the shape of this cloud or this cloud, there's some really big volumes in here. But if you look close, there's an awful lot of high frequency detail. It's just hard to separate it. The high pass filter will help you do that. So you plug this in, you can see the lower the radius goes, the more we're kind of focusing on those high frequency details. If you were to auto level this, you'll see we're taking this cloud and getting rid of all of these larger shapes and focusing only on the higher frequencies. So I'm going to do something similar here with this noise to really try to zero in on these little clusters, for lack of a better word, like this. We'll do something similar. We'll just maybe subtract these or something. Whenever I'm rerouting this, I'm just holding shift and dragging to the new position, and it'll do all the reroutes for you. This is cool. Just some more high frequency stuff that's kind of varied up because it already was a varied noise to begin with. And if we don't like how consistent that is again, I would just do the same thing, grab one of these, offset it a bit, maybe rotate it 90 degrees. You gotta be very careful when you're rotating stuff with a transform node that you're not rotating it by non-90 degree turns. Because if you do, you'll break the tiling. The transform has no way of knowing that if you do slight rotations, how to make it make sense across the tile borders. So you want to make sure you're doing only 90 degree turns. The safe transform grayscale will allow you to do 45 degree turns. If you do feel you want to do this, you can get it back by using something like a make it tile photo grayscale. This will fix the tiling that's broken. I normally take the precision of the masks down all the way. So you can do it. If you really absolutely feel like you need that slightly off 90 degree angle. I don't think I do here. But it's just something to be aware of, that you can fix those things, especially if it's a texture that's as noisy as that one. I'm just going to use this as a mask. Again, it's subtle, right? But it does add up over time, because right now this is pretty consistent, especially because of that high pass filter. That noise is fairly uniform all over the texture. Having this just to break that up, you can, if you watch the 3D view, you can see the difference. It just meters it a bit, right? It becomes a little bit less intense in some areas, a little bit more intense in others. And a lot of texturing is that, right? Slowly layering on subtle things. It's almost like 100 subtle things rather than, 2 or 3 brute force things. So this is cool. I think we're going to need to get much finer, I still think. So we'll do stuff like, we can even use some of the dirt nodes maybe. Some of these can occasionally be useful. I like dirt 2 here is kind of cool. And I'll put this on, and this again, I'll just subtract. This is to get some really speckly weird noise here. By weird, I mean just not an even edge. A lot of the stuff we've been putting on right now is fairly soft. A lot of these noises are pretty billowy or soft. This one's a lot more jagged. We get these really sharp edges and transitions, and I like that. That contrast will be nice. Whereas this noise looks quite a bit different from the stuff we put on before it. It's really kind of ragged. But I don't mind the look of that. You could even choose to add to add these on if you wanted them to kind of bump out. That's kind of cool. That creates like a really interesting new effect. Although we might do a bit of both. So maybe we'll do a little bit of both here. We'll do a subtract first. And this one's really kind of uniform everywhere because these are all very similarly colored. In terms of their gray value, they're all kind of the same. So again, you would probably want to mask this. We could grab something a bit more interesting, like a moisture noise for our mask. We've done a lot of reusing this guy. So let's just switch it up a bit. I'm going to grab that moisture noise and again, just use them as a mask. For the same reason, just sort of tones it down in certain areas, makes it stronger in others, add some nice variety. These are probably a little too intense. Yeah, I like that. Cool. What else we do here? Let's grab, well, we said we were going to do the same thing here. So why don't we do that? We're going to get another dirt. I'm just going to hit the random seed button up here. And with this one, we'll screen on or add. Since we're going to be using such low opacity, just a slight add will be totally fine. And we'll reuse this mask. So I'll take a free transform. We'll rotate this guy again, like 90. Offset him a bit, plug him in here. And this is cool because we'll just have those little bits that pop out, which are kind of neat. And we think they're a little too, I think they don't blend totally well with the background here when when we use them to raise it, when we've added them. So I might just blur these a little bit. I'm not liking how specifically noisy they are, so we'll just drag this back a bit. Something like this. I think it'll just help them blend in a bit better. Yeah, I like that more. Cool. And now what I want to do is get some really, really fine noise. There's a lot of ways you could do this. One that I like is actually use something that already is fairly noisy. But I want a really uniform noise. So something that's really cool here is use something like a reaction diffusion. This is going to create these really tiny little shapes, especially if we go really low radius. We can create this like hyper fine noise, which I think can be really cool looking. We're sort of making this, I'm looking at my other monitor on this kind of stuff. Like there's this really repetitive high frequency noise. It's almost everywhere. It's obviously not as strong in all areas. Like it's a bit weaker there and it's really obvious here. But that's what I'm hoping that noise does. So I'll blur these a little because if we add that on just as it is, that'll be pretty rough. Give it, yeah, that's going to be cool. It's going to add a bunch of variety here. And auto level that. After the blur, we're losing some black and white value, so I want to punch that back up a little. It's slight, but it will matter. And then I still think we want to blur these because if we do add these on, it's going to be really uniform. It's going to be very much the same intensity everywhere. And we'll do something like probably, they look like they're mostly raised, but let's try an add sub first. Add sub's nice when you want to push some stuff in and pull some stuff out. Yeah. And that's cool. And it's obviously too intense, but more importantly, it's really uniform. I think it does a really good job of capturing that shape. But if you look close, you'll see that it's not super consistent. Like in this area here, it's softened out, but then it's like bunches of high frequency noise here. And then it does have these areas where it sort of chills out a bit. So another good time for like a slope blur, or you could try a slope blur, a non-uniform blur. Just to try to vary this up a bit. This is kind of cool looking, actually. Just out of curiosity, what does this look like? That's kind of cool. That wasn't intended, but it is interesting. I kind of like the look of this. It has these little like kind of micro layers. Yeah. That's kind of cool. And it does add a bit of noise. If you push the blur further, it's going to kind of loop around and create these little speckles. I kind of like this actually. I still think we want, yeah, this is nice. Got to always be on the lookout for some of those happy accents because they do, you never know when they're going to show up. I don't mind that. I think it does add a nice variety to the surface here. I still think we do actually want the ones we had up here the way they were before we did the slope blur. So I'm going to do that again. We'll just add sub this. Be way too strong, but we'll pull it back. And then again, we are going to try to make this be not, so I'll use something like a non-uniform blur. This guy. And I'll use that moisture noise again, at least as a first step with the blur here. And this is just to, yeah, like to soften some areas out, right? You can see it here that you get this really sharp area and then it kind of blurs out. I do think I actually want to zoom this moisture noise out a bit. So I'm going to go to it and hit the divide to zoom out. And that works pretty well, but I do think it's too, the areas that it's blurry versus the areas that are sharp are too big. So let's try something more like the Gaussian spots or something. That's kind of cool. Now we have these much more kind of like local areas. Put the samples down, actually, you can make it a bit noisier in the blur. Or we could combine these blur maps as well. Like screen this on. This might be a bit more interesting. Yeah, that's really cool. You have a lot more variety there. You can see that makes a crazy difference, right? We have the really high frequency details only in some parts. Now I'm going to go back here and maybe blur that reaction diffusion a bit more. And maybe even try to put that radius on it a bit smaller. I might not be able to get it a ton smaller than that. There we go. That's cool. If we want to make this a lot, we want to pass out some of those lower frequencies, we could run a high pass here as well. Get it really nice and sharp. Another auto level. Yeah, I like that. That's cool. So a lot of this is just like, we're just experimenting now, right? Just a lot of what you're doing here is just taking a bass noise you find interesting, doing some sort of manipulation to it, right? Whether you're using blurs, auto levels again to get that range back, high passing them. Usually what you're doing is either controlling the scale or size of the detail and then the frequency of it, how often it happens, right? Is it something closer to like a Perlin noise where it's really large scale, low frequency, right? Huge shapes that don't occur often, or really small shapes that occur often. And that's really all you're doing between the blend and the noise you've picked. And then it's just, choosing correct blend modes, or at least blend modes that are going to suit the situation. And then coming up with some masks to use to kind of meter that effect across the surface. But I think this is really effective. I think we've gotten pretty close to that mortar. In fact, I think we're good to call the mortar finished. And what we'll do next is move on to the main graph, because we've done our mortar slice generator and then our mortar layer generator. So this will be kind of the background, right? It's hard to, you got to keep your eye on the prize because this is still just the backdrop, right? We probably actually won't see a ton of this by the end of the day once we plug all of our cobblestones and skulls and fun stuff into it. It's just going to be that nice, consistent backdrop for us.